Do we have any
Sorry.
more opening commentary, or should we dive into it?
I have an entire presentation, Arn.
Let's
Um,
hear it.
All right, sounds good. Let me just pull up a few things here. Ah, perfect. All right. So so we're starting today is called the Deuteronomistic History. So I wanted to discuss it because it has a very long history of scholarship, and there are a lot of questions surrounding it. There are a lot of things to account for, and I kind of want to talk about some of the general models that scholars have proposed. So, the Deuteronomistic History. What is it and how is it compiled? So, we can go to slide 2. So, generally speaking, it's the work spanning from Joshua through Second Kings, excluding Ruth. However, parts of Deuteronomy are also included in this. We can link these texts as one narrative based on a few factors, including similar words and phrases like until this day and at that time. There are a few other ones as well, combined with its similar ideologies concerning the nature of kingship, God's vengeance, and a whole bunch more. Traditionally, these books are assigned to different authors that can be identified with biblical characters. So last week when we covered the death of Moses, we covered how Joshua is generally thought to have written the section where Moses dies, while Moses wrote the rest of it. Joshua, being the first book of the Deuteronomistic history proper that we're starting today, has been seen as being written by Joshua himself. Judges was thought to be written by Samuel, along with First Samuel. Second Samuel was thought to be written by Gad and Nathan, according to an interpretation of First Chronicles 29:29. Uh, Now the acts of King David, from first to last, are written in the record of the seer Samuel, and in all the records of the prophet Nathan, and in the records of the seer Gad. Although sometimes it was thought to have been written by David himself. And then First and Second Kings were thought to be written by Jeremiah. So we can move on to slide 3. So one of the initial hints that led scholars to conclude otherwise was the repeated inclusion of the phrase until this day. The reason it's significant is because it assumes that a long amount of time had passed. Today, we generally use it kind of hyperbolically, but in ancient literature, this just wasn't the case. Over time, there have been a few different proposals. Usually, this was waved away by early rabbis as meaning forever, or that the doctrine, structure, or whatever they're referring to would stand forever. In the Jewish tradition, this was generally the case until Abravanel in the 15th century raised questions about it. He pointed out the usage of the phrase implies that it was a long time, or that it was written a long time after. He even goes so far as to say that Joshua doesn't even say it was written by Joshua. So why would he think that he wrote it? Instead, he actually thought that Joshua was written by Samuel. He stood with other rabbis in believing that Judges was written by Samuel as well. But even he points out the problems with a view based on that when he cites the fact that Judges 18:30 says that then the Danites set up the idol for themselves. Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the time the land went into captivity. So that reference right there, until the time that the land went into captivity, the earliest time that could possibly be written was during the Assyrian invasion. So that's in like the 8th century. So we can move on to slide 4. So in Christian traditions, this phrase had a slightly different understanding. There was a common belief that the Torah was actually destroyed and had to be rewritten by Ezra. So the inclusion of until this day was explained by Ezra's additions to the text. So this position was held by Jerome and Andreas Macias. Augustine, on the other hand, agreed with the traditional Jewish interpretation, meaning forever. Both Luther and Calvin believed that the phrase denoted the time of the author, so they would have had different meaning depending on the book. But Calvin would place would have placed it later because he believed Eliezer compiled the books and also composed Joshua, weirdly enough. John Wesley actually believed that these were inserted passages by holy men, essentially inserted by pious scribes. So we can go to the next slide. So here are some more secular views, right? So critical scholarship, or the I guess a more secular study of the text on this, actually began with Thomas Hobbes, and he actually started pointing out the issues in secular circles with until this day. Some of the thinkers at the time, like Isaac Le Pereire, I think. I probably am mispronouncing that. I don't know. He believed that Deuteronomy was written during the time of David, basing his reading on Deuteronomy 2:22. Spinoza even chimed in, believing that the entire Deuteronomistic history was written by one later author, but modern critical methods were soon to be applied. So we can go to the next slide. So, the dawn of critical scholarship. In the 19th century, we see the groundbreaking work of Wilhelm de Witt. His work was actually a precursor to Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis, otherwise known as JEDP. A lot of people like to think of Wellhausen as like the father of modern biblical scholarship, but it was actually this guy. He was the first modern scholar to link the scroll found in Josiah's time to the text of Deuteronomy. He does it in a footnote, by the way. Although Voltaire seems to have made this observation earlier, uh, his model was incomplete, though, when it came to the Deuteronomistic history. References to until this day referred to a whole bunch of different times. DeWitt noticed a lot of other problems as well. He'd spent many years writing and working on a book where he argued that the Pentateuch should more properly be called a Tetratuch, with the book of Deuteronomy being attached later during the time of Josiah, or at least a primitive form of it. He was actually going to publish a book about how Deuteronomy was linked to Josiah, but he turned his head, and all of a sudden, at the same time he publishes his work, gearing up for his next one, Johann Vater comes around and publishes a work about how Deuteronomy is linked with the historical books. So these ideas together cause a lot of scholars to believe that there was, in fact, a hexateuch, that is from Genesis through Joshua, like one single word from Genesis through Joshua. Joshua is seen as being part of the same JEDP tradition. I do want to note, however, these are more modern creations. We have no evidence of a compilation including the Torah and Joshua as a standalone text. In fact, I think our earliest canonical description by Josephus separates the Torah and the rest of the books. He specifically cites the 5 books of Moses and then goes on to cite the prophets. This also applies to the idea of a tetratuch, so the story from Genesis through Numbers. These are more modern day hypothetical creations rather than ancient attested documents. So when it comes to the rest of the Deuteronomistic history, DeWitt thought it was written during the exile, along with a whole bunch of other biblical literature. So he, along with a few others at the time, noticed that the historical books of Joshua through Second Kings were very similar. I mean, so similar they must share authors. People like DeWitt are the reason we even have the word Deuteronomistic. So we can go to the next slide. So in 1943, Martin Noth published a pretty short work based on an earlier study done by Heinrich Ewald, or Ewald, not sure how to pronounce it. So this was the foundational work for the idea of not only a pre-exilic work, but an exilic redaction of the work as well. So it would have been written in 2 stages. At first, you have an initial history written as Josianic propaganda, then an exilic redaction. According to Noth, however, the Deuteronomist used many sources to compile a history. This included not only the works that are directly cited in the Deuteronomistic history, but also shorter narratives like the history of David's rise. He believed that this was a standalone text. This would have been written during the occupation, and he places it somewhere around 560 BCE. So he believes that it was all exilic. The reason he thought there was no way a pre-exilic edition could have existed was because how it treated the monarchy in Israel in general in such a somber way. Like, it's your fault. You did this to yourself, kind of thing, when talking about the exile. This idea wouldn't be accepted immediately. It would gain more acceptance in the 50s, though. There was an initial pushback from people like Eisfeld. His primary concern was that an evolution of the text, or a diachronic concern, could not be established because there were too many contradictions. How could a later author not account for these or edit these out? For example, the issue of timing in Joshua 1 through 3, and I know we're going to cover that today. In Joshua 1:11, Joshua commands the people through his own officers, prepare your provisions, for in 3 days you are to cross over this Jordan, to go in to take possession of the land that the Lord your God gives you to possess. So keep that in mind. The people will get there in 3 days. In Joshua 2, spies are sent to the land, but they're essentially staying with a prostitute who lived in the city wall. When the king finds out, the spies are told to go hide in the hill country for 3 days to stay safe in 216. They're told to stay safe for 3 days in 216, and then they do it in 222. So after hiding for 3 days, they return to Joshua at the end of chapter 2. So surely this is where they enter the land, right? Just like the old warlord said. Unfortunately, no. While the next chapter, chapter 3, is the entrance into the land, it's only after another 4 days. When they get to the Jordan, they camp there for 3 days. And on that day, the people are told, tomorrow we set out in 3-5. So altogether, that's a 3 days waiting for the spies to return, the 3 days camping, plus if you want to count that extra day, the day they actually were entering the land. This, of course, led people like Noth to go, hey, that whole chapter 2 thing was probably added, and led Eisfeld to go, yeah, but if 1 and 2, if 1 and 3 were together, why is there this double future proclamation of entering the land in 111 and 3:2? And why is the first one on the third day, but the second one after 3 days? So, yeah, it does get a little weird, but the issue wasn't exactly with Noth's model. It was more about how it was put together. But either way, uh, we can go on to the next slide here. So these are adaptations and competition to Noth's model. So Noth's model garnered a lot of support in German scholarship, while scholars in the US lean more toward FM Cross's competing idea. So Cross decided to bring it back to the OG ideas of DeWitt and Ewald. There were two layers to the Deuteronomistic history, one pre-exilic and the other exilic. He believed that the original, or Josianic, ending to the text was in was in Second Kings 25:23, where we're told that neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to the Lord as he did, with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his strength, in accordance with the law, with all the law of Moses. Did you catch it? Nor after. If this was written in the period of Josiah, saying nor after would make no sense. Everyone at the time would be like, what the fuck are you talking about? You don't know that. The fuck you mean after? So if this was written in the period of Josiah, sorry. So yeah, to them it was just like, listen, there was no way this could have been the original ending. There's no way this could have been written during the period of Josiah. Concerns like that led to another influential school called the Göttingen School, because it was centered around a group of scholars in Göttingen, Germany. This was headed by Rudolf Smend, and later his model was added upon by his students, but it shared many similarities to Noth's models. In this model, the entire Deuteronomistic history is exilic, but it was written in layers. So first there was a Deuteronomistic historian, an initial DtrH, that will we'll just say that the DtrH, whenever I use that sigla, it's the Deuteronomistic Historian, the guy writing it. Um, we're gonna get to more sigla in just a bit. So the guy who initially wrote to explain the exile. However, there was a later author, according to Smend, about a decade later, around 560 BCE, that added a few things here and there to basically correct the Deuteronomistic Historian. This is usually termed a DtrN. And N here stands for nomistic, or concerning the law. It's coming from the Greek word for law, nomos. His students would later hypothesize another later layer, also exilic, that was related to a prophetic school, which they called DtrP. This isn't too far off base. There are definitely a ton of similarities in these texts and the prophetic works. There's a whole book written about it that I read through as well. So there's a ton to cover when it comes to connections with the prophets. Viola, one of the students, would it would go further and actually argue that the texts favoring the monarchy were from the Deuteronomistic Historian, while any text suggesting David was in sin was from DtrP. He had a few other benchmarks as well, but he did accept that there was extant pre-Deuteronomistic historian material that was constructed in a narrative way, like the way we have the Deuteronomistic history now, but it was compiled into these narratives during this period if it existed by itself at all. The problem doesn't really end there. In the 90s, Provan and Lofnik separately came to two conclusions that gave us another look or another way to look at this issue. Provan believed that the initial composition of the Deuteronomistic history consisted of just Samuel and Kings, or at least the bulk of them, and was written during Josiah's time. Lufnik came to a conclusion about the compilation of Deuteronomy through Joshua, saying that they form a conquest narrative, and he called this layer DTRL, coming from the word for land conquest, the German word for land conquest. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce that word. I looked it up. Holy shit. No, it's like one of those German words that's made of like 18 other German words. Uh, so it kind of left judges in a weird spot, but the idea of seeing a historical narrative and a more mythical conquest narrative isn't actually the worst idea, in my opinion. So we can go to the next slide here. So, untangling the mess. How how do we untangle this mess of ideas? And it is a mess, right? It seems like it's ridiculous. There's so many siglas, so many layers. How are we supposed to keep track of all of it? Well, that's easy. We make a bigger mess. So, how is a work filled with so many contradictions, yet so many weird consistencies? While the story doesn't fully make sense when read critically, it contains similar themes and language throughout. At least if it had one author, it would be far more internally logical. So, how do we explain it all? Perhaps it's best to talk about a Deuteronomistic school, and this is the kind of the route that I take. This would be a scribal school representing its own tradition and writing style that would develop the text over time depending on their social situation. This is a pretty basic model and seems pretty attractive, but then again, so does Cross's model at first glance. So we need to make sure we look at it critically. In my opinion, a Deuteronomistic school makes a lot of sense, but the details can definitely change, as in when was the first version and when were the additions. Van Setters goes back to the single exilic author, arguing for the general unity of the Deuteronomistic history, while people like Romer argue for a Deuteronomistic historian in the Josianic period, whose edition was subsequently edited in the exilic and post-exilic periods. So to be sure, Romer makes a pretty strong case against the unity, and Van Setters argues that many of the literary motifs feature in Babylonian and Assyrian texts. He also parallels the historiography traditions in Egypt, Greece, and the Hittite Empire to argue for this exilic date and how the majority of it is basically from the exilic period. The old stuff was basically a late, like, and when I say old stuff, I mean the stuff that is chronologically older, as in like, you know, Joshua, Judges, David's Rise, like the old stuff, not like old textually. Um, so the old stuff was basically a late fiction used to justify a lot of the current events. And to quickly jump back to the initial discussion of until this day appearances, I want to mention Child's idea that that these were later editions referring to the time of the redactor. So you'd have an initial text written, and then a later copyist in the future would be like, oh, that's still around now. I'm just going to add until this day, kind of thing. So next slide here. Yeah, so some basic takeaways. These are some general models for interpretation we can use. You can think of them as just very basic frameworks. So you have pre-exilic, exilic, and then post-exilic. You have exilic with exilic era redactions. You have this idea of a single exilic author, or you have a pre-exilic version and an exilic one, with or without redactions. So these are more general models, right? You have a lot of options in your potential frameworks, but there are probably other considerations that haven't been discussed here. Any of these general models can include other source material or previous documents and stories that existed before the codification period as well. Essentially, unraveling the Deuteronomistic history is incredibly difficult and has caused problems for like nearly 200 years of critical endeavors. There are both contradictions and thematic unities. There are borrowed literary motifs and unique ones. There's just a lot that goes into understanding these sets of books, and I really hope this gives everyone watching a good crash course on understanding scholarly discourse surrounding it. Uh, and the last slide is just it's just sources. So
Hey, Lawrence, so if I hear you right, when I read my MacArthur Study Bible and on the authorship and date, he says, and I quote, although the author is not named, the most probable candidate is Joshua, who was the key eyewitness to the events recorded. Maybe a little bit off. Is that what I'm hearing?
maybe a little bit off, just
Oh,
a little.